True crime is a genre dedicated to serial killers and cold cases, and as you will find throughout this video, true crime in general is very controversial. My first introduction to it was watching videos about how many who consider themselves part of the community fantasize about serial killers, most notably Jeffrey Dahmer and Ted Bundy, who many consider to be the fandom's favorites. In the same breath, admitting that the fact the fandom even has favorites is problematic in of itself. Many also clarify that the true crime community itself is not the issue, just this subgenre that romanticizes it. Though you will find that I do question whether the origin of the problem resides in the formation of the community itself, rather than a branch within it. Regardless, I will be clarifying that an interest in true crime is not itself wrong. Curious as to how those who commit these actions feel about it, how they've justified it. This video will instead be discussing where I think the community's harmless intentions turn into ignorance and apathy, how the genre designed itself to do this to the viewers. True crime as a genre has heavily desensitized many to the horrors of these killers' actions, purposely romanticizing them in order to turn these events into entertainment, leading to efforts for closure or justice to be in vain. Before we begin this, I will be providing some context onto who Dahmer is. I will be quoting a presentation I made last year in my psychology class. I'll give a timestamp for you if you either already know who he is or don't really care. As much as it is your choice, I do encourage you to watch this portion if you don't know much about Dahmer, because understanding his actions and the horror of them will help you understand why people defending him is disgusting. In Dahmer's very early childhood, Jeffrey had been described as energetic and happy, but he did suffer problems. At age 4, he got surgery to fix his double hernia, but the surgery had negative effects. He had become withdrawn and had mood changes. His mother was depressed and suicidal, and his father would leave often, coming back only to dedicate time to his mother. He developed a disdain for his baby brother, who got his parents' attention. His father would ask Jeffrey to clean out the animal carcasses under their house, and he was fascinated by it. His father, thinking this was normal, had taught his son how to bleach and clean the bones. He would collect dead animals, and had taken a dead dog's head and stapled it to a tree. One time, he gave a tadpole to his teacher, and when he found out the teacher gave it to another student, had gone to the student's house, taken the tadpole from the aquarium, and lit it on fire with gasoline. At age 13, he began having dark fantasies including murder and necrophilia. He kept this under control until after his parents' divorce. He graduated high school and killed his first victim. Dahmer enrolled in OSU, but due to consistent alcohol use, he failed most of his classes and dropped out during the second semester. He later enrolled in the United States Army, where he trained as a medical specialist at Fort Sam Houston, and was later stationed at Baumholder, Germany, where he was a combat medic. Due to consistent alcohol abuse, he was honorably discharged in 1981. He had moved to Florida in an attempt to live on his own, but he spent most of his money on alcohol and was evicted, returning to Ohio. He continued to abuse alcohol and was arrested for drunk and disorderly conduct, leading his father to force him to move in with his grandmother in Wisconsin. This had originally worked, and he even got a job as a phlebotomist, but after 10 months, he was laid off, and he had no work for 2 years. In 1985, he became a mixer at a chocolate factory. Here, a man propositioned Dahmer for a sexual favor, and though he did not respond, it's believed this incident led to a revival of his fantasies. Dahmer had also stated that during sexual encounters, it frustrated him that his partners would move, which caused him to begin giving them sedatives. In 1988, his grandma forced him to move out, and he moved into his own apartment. In 1989, after more allegations, he was required to register as a sex offender. Dahmer's first killing was Stephen Hicks. He had picked up the hitchhiker and brought him home to drink, and Hicks had started talking about girls, causing Dahmer to realize any sexual propositions he would make would be turned down. So he killed Hicks. His second victim, Stephen Twomey, was an unintentional murder. He had claimed he only intended to drug Twomey and explore his body, but when he woke up, he found the man dead, which shocked him. After Twomey's murder, he began actively seeking victims. In 1990, he had purchased a Polaroid camera. At this point forward, he would begin taking suggestive photos of his victims, dead or alive, with this camera. Konarak was one of Dahmer's most infamous victims. The boy was an immigrant from Laos, Southeast Asian country, and his older brother was also one of Dahmer's victims. However, after getting molested, his brother escaped. The family believed Dahmer had been imprisoned for this crime. However, Konarak had gone to meet his friends at the mall on May 26th and never returned. Dahmer had offered Konarak money if he posed for a sexual photo shoot, and despite the fact he was a minor, he agreed. He drugged Conrack, but the next day, the boy had an opportunity to escape. Sandra Smith and Nicole Childress found the boy and called the police. When the police arrived, Dahmer also arrived, and claimed the boy was his 19-year-old boyfriend that he had gotten into a fight with. Conrack was bleeding from his head due to a hole drilled into it. He was also naked, and blood was coming out of his anus. The cops, without checking Dahmer's history of sexual convictions, released Conrack into his care, where he killed the boy. Tracy Edwards had been able to escape Dahmer after realizing the man intended to kill him, even recalling that Dahmer had informed him he intended to eat his heart. He had escaped and told the cops a freak tried to kill him. Dahmer was found guilty of 15 out of 16 of his murders and sentenced to 15 years in prison. He was later found guilty of the 16th murder as well and sentenced to 16 years. He had insisted on being given a copy of the Bible in prison and became a born-again Christian, stating, "If a person doesn't think there's a God to be accountable to, then what's the point of trying to modify your behavior to keep it within acceptable ranges?" That's how I thought anyway. In 1994, he was beaten to death by fellow prison inmate Christopher Scarver, who had been repulsed by Dahmer's crimes and said that God told him to kill Dahmer. Dahmer's most obvious impact is that his killing of Conrack is often used as an example of police incompetence, and to this day, Conrack's death is used as a cautionary tale. Many books, television shows, and movies have been dedicated to deciphering what was the strange case of Dahmer. Dahmer was fully aware of what he was doing, and he knew exactly how to hide it. He knew how he'd kill, and even when there was a slip-up, he was quick to cover it up. Despite the fact he later started trying to turn his victims into zombies, he began his murders to fulfill sadistic fantasies he had garnered since he was 13, and even said, at first, he attempted to push away his dark thoughts, but later stopped fighting against them. Okay, we're done with all that context, let's get into it. But first, we need to discuss my first point, that this genre desensitizes people to these atrocities. And don't sit here and say that's not true when people are literally out here saying they think it should have been more morbid and bragging about the fact they didn't think it was that bad at all. Look, I'm somebody who can handle a whole lot, and even my stomach turns when I see the Polaroids Dahmer took of his victims. I would even go as far as saying that this leads people to have less sympathy for the victims and more sympathy for the killer themselves. In one of my classes the other day, people were saying they felt sorry for Dahmer because he was a changed man, and specifically, and I quote, "If you think he's a bad person, you didn't watch the show." Now, I knew quite a bit about Dahmer before I even knew the show would exist. About 2 years ago, a string of videos had popped up into my recommended discussing people who thirsted over serial killers or shooters, particularly Ted Bundy, Jeffrey Dahmer, and the Columbine shooters. Last year in my psychology class, I also needed to make a presentation, which I'd used to write some context earlier in the video. I'm not the Dahmer expert, and I'd be lying if I implied I knew everything about him. But I think it's undeniable that defending his actions is completely invalidating the victims. Furthermore, if people aren't disgusted by his actions, I truly believe that's a cause for concern, and a huge negative effect of people treating these events in this way, making them think of it more as entertainment than they think of it as murders. Again, there's no harm in being curious about serial killers. No harm in being able to handle some things, but to this extent it is concerning, and it's a sign of being desensitized. People should not be desensitized to things such as murder or cannibalism or necrophilia, because objectively that does somewhat normalize it, not just within the mind, but in the society when it occurs on a huge scale. So I believe this diverges us onto our next point, purposely romanticizing serial killers in order to turn these events into entertainment. Now, I will again clarify, finding interest in serial killers or shooters or whatever is not the worst thing. For example, I know a while back there was that YouTube channel on everyone's recommended called JCS Criminal Psychology. Some of their videos like What Pretending to be Crazy Looks Like, Guilty Until Proven Innocent, Jennifer's Solution. I watch some of those videos too, and I do want to say, while these do both fall under true crime, the Criminal Psychology channel is not the type of entertainment I'm talking about. Mostly because these videos weren't really intended for entertainment. More so, they were intended for educational purposes. I do not believe the Dahmer show falls under the category of education. I mean, it does call itself a TV drama, because, you know, necrophilia and molestation are drama. When I say there's drama going on in my life, I'm not talking about boys. I'm talking about this. That's sarcasm, by the way. Just so you know. A theme with a fair amount of my videos, or things I discuss outside of my videos, is that the problem has been there for a long time, and we certainly had the resources to know before it became a trendy discussion. We already knew Dan Schneider should have been in prison before McCurdy's memoir. We already knew ignorant teens could get sucked into a pipeline before Andrew Tate. The people who knew Dahmer's history absolutely could have known he was going down a dark path before he went to court. The point of me saying this isn't to say, by the way, I made some videos, you should go, watch them, because they're kinda like this. That's not my point. My point is that when people focus on things because they're entertaining or because they're a trendy discussion, the problem can go on for far longer than necessary and cause a whole world of hurt plenty of times over. Conorak and his family is a good example of this. After what happened to his brother, Dahmer should have never had the opportunity to go after another victim, but he did, and look how that turned out. 16 victims. Really just sit on that. Think about that number. 16 lives ended. Why did it have to take 16 before he went to court? Why couldn't it have stopped before, when cops knew Dahmer was dangerous? How ignorant does somebody really have to be a cop in the position of being told a dying boy was somebody's boyfriend and returning him into the custody of that man? And how ignorant and apathetic does somebody have to be to know that that event and others related to it took place and think of it as entertaining, knowing it was a real event? What kind of thought process is that? And why are people allowing that thought process to continue being, but also encourage it? And for what? Money? From a documentary the victims' families didn't consent to? That's disgusting, let's be honest. Going back to what my classmates said, I don't like that anybody can look at that show and come out of it thinking the message is that people can change. No, I don't think that should be the point. I think the moral of Dahmer's... just what he did, I think the moral should be that we need to stop horrible things before they happen. We need to speak up before they become worse and cause permanent damage. We need to hold people accountable when they try to let things go under the radar. Because if we don't, things could get worse. And with Dahmer, or anybody who could be the next, I don't think seeing if that may be coming true is a chance any of us should be willing to take. So, my third point. I've brought him up a lot in this video, but I'm doing this because I think it's the most notable thing and the most disgusting, just because it never had to end the way it did. Conorak and what happened to him, to me, highlights everything that made Dahmer so heart-wrenching and infuriating. Everything with Conorak should have made things questionable. And this isn't everybody involved, because those two women who tried to help Conorak, they really did try. But the people who I will be referring to as the system, not just because that is who they collectively were, but because they were the ones who did hold the final ring. They were the people who could have stopped this. They were so purposely apathetic, leading Dahmer's reign of terror to go on for longer than necessary and take longer than necessary to end. It's just so gross. It would be so incredibly disrespectful to ever say that Conorak got justice. And the reason why I think that is because the cops who returned him to Dahmer are still cops. They were rehired and lived pretty normal lives as far as I know. At least one of them got honors in 2017, so, ignored shady behavior that was... a whole ass child just dying and the murderer claiming the child was drunk is well, that's a pretty big mess up. The kind you should, never, ever make. And be heavily punished for making. I do not care if they feel sorry. Because I do not believe there is any way they could have seen that and not tried to stop things from there. That's like, I think they should never have a job where their inaction could have that disastrous of an effect. Like, I don't know what kind of job, like a baker or something. Like, not doing something as a baker, that wouldn't have that big of an effect, I don't think. I don't know, I'm not a baker. Just, nothing in law enforcement. Ever. Ever, ever. And besides all that, let's think. Oh, yeah. The victims' families got no say in this. Just trauma, fully brought to the forefront. A sister of one of Dahmer's victims, Rita, made a statement essentially saying her trauma was unearthed because Netflix was greedy, and said it felt like they were harsh and careless. Which I think any sane person would agree with. So, what's the takeaway here? Well, there's a lot of takeaways here, but I would say the main one is just maybe we as people just need to exercise kindness. Like, it's okay to understand Dahmer did get better or whatever, but just be serious about it. Don't say you wish it was more gory. Don't say you didn't think it was that bad. Don't say you feel bad for him. Just really think about what happened, keep the victims and their families in mind, and maybe try to be respectful. Just maybe. This is one of those times where if you have something nice to say, keep it to yourself. Just don't. Okay? Okay. I do also want to clarify, I understand this is a complicated issue, and I don't think a lot of people process that. It, like many issues we face, is an issue because we aren't properly dealing with the causes of it, which I would argue there are multiple. I haven't said this because I don't think I can properly explain and expand my points, but I have for a while believed this culture of women always fall for the bad guys, women don't like nice guys, mafia boss fan fiction where the boss falls in love with some kidnapped person or something, I don't know. My point is, I think this area of how we treat women in regards to their attraction to men and who we expect them to be attracted to and who we realistically kind of teach them to be attracted to, I think this should be investigated more. Because I do intuitively feel like this is a cause not being brought up within this conversation. But again, that's just a hunch, and I don't really know how to explain my point further, so I would not be the person to listen to about that. Part of the reason I didn't bring it up is because I do think the normalcy surrounding how these topics are brought up on a surface level and romanticized on a surface level is still the main cause for concern. So that's the video I made. I'm not really going to make an outro to this because I don't think it's appropriate to, but also just an FYI, I will be reading comments, but if you do try to defend him or say I'm wrong for feeling bad for the victims and not him, or something along those lines, I will not be responding, but I do think you need professional help if you're about to comment that. Another thing to keep in mind, if you wouldn't say it to the victims or their families' faces, don't say it at all. In fact, if you can avoid it, don't even think it. Good talk.